The sun was lazily creeping over the horizon, bathing the Austin suburb in a soft orange glow. Aiden Brooks, standing by the open hood of his old 1978 pickup, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His hands, stained with motor oil, were deftly wielding a wrench, and the old radio on the porch blared country tunes, mixing with the morning cicadas. The yard of their small house was littered with Sophie's toys, from a hot pink ball to a plastic toy tractor that she and her dad had tried to fix the day before. "Dad, if I hit it with a hammer, will it start faster?" Sophie's voice rang out. She was sitting on the grass nearby, holding a toy hammer in her hands and looking at an old tire with a serious expression. Aiden grinned, not looking up from the engine, his dark hair, slightly streaked with gray, plastered to his forehead. "No, little star, a hammer will only make it worse. Better give me that wrench over there with the red handle." He nodded at the toolbox. Sophie jumped up, her blonde curls bouncing, and ran enthusiastically toward the box, her little sandals slapping the grass and a smile on her face, as if she had been entrusted with a mission of national importance. "Here, Dad." She proudly held out the key, almost dropping it on her foot. "Well done, assistant," Aiden winked, accepting the tool. "With you, we'll bring this old man back to life in no time." Caitlin walked out of the house, holding 2 mugs of coffee. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and there was a watercolor stain on her shirt from her morning of art with Sophie. She set 1 mug down on the porch next to Aiden and smiled. "Are you 2 at it again?" she said, squinting at the truck. "Will that jalopy ever run, or do you just like to take it apart?" Aiden snorted as he sipped his coffee, his blue eyes twinkling mischievously. "He's going, Kate, and when he does, I'll take you and Sophie to the lake. We'll roast marshmallows like last year." "Hooray, marshmallows." Sophie clapped her hands, almost dropping the hammer. "Mom, can I fry some too? Just without the fire, it's hot." Caitlin laughed as she sat down next to her daughter and brushed a lock of hair out of her face. "Of course, my artist. But only if Dad doesn't decide to set the whole forest on fire with his perfect fire." "Hey, that fire was almost perfect," Aiden countered, feigning indignation. "The wind was just wrong." Their laughter echoed through the yard, warm and easy. It was their usual Saturday ritual, Aiden tinkering with the truck, Sophie helping, and Caitlin teasing them over coffee. The house, surrounded by a low wooden fence, was their little world. The lawn was a little overgrown, but the beds of daisies Caitlin had planted last spring added to the cozy atmosphere. The neighbor's dog, Barney, barked in the distance, and the smell of freshly cut grass mingled with the aroma of coffee. Inside, the house was no less lively. The kitchen smelled of pancakes and bacon as Caitlin cooked breakfast. Sophie's drawings adorned the walls, bright splashes of color depicting the sun, trees, and their family. Dad with a wrench, Mom with a paintbrush, and Sophie herself with a giant ice cream sundae. Aiden, despite his tired shifts at the auto shop, always found time for mornings like these. He loved those moments when everything was in its place. Sophie chatting away, Caitlin humming, and he could just be with them. "Dad, tell me how you and Mom met." Sophie plopped down on the grass next to Aiden, her curious eyes shining. Aiden smiled as he put the key down. He loved this story, even though he had told it dozens of times. "Well, Star, it was in college. I was a skinny kid fixing motorcycles for pocket money. And your mom, she came barreling into the shop like she was going to conquer the world." Caitlin rolled her eyes at this, but her lips twitched into a smile. "Don't listen to him, Sophie. I just wanted to fix my bike, and your dad decided he was a great mechanic and broke my pedal." "Broken it?" Aiden protested, theatrically pressing his hand to his chest. "I improved it, and anyway, if it weren't for that pedal, you wouldn't have agreed to go for coffee with me." "Oh, you just left me no choice," Caitlin retorted, winking at Sophie. "He was so persistent that I agreed, if only he would stop talking." Sophie giggled, hugging her knees. "And then you got married, and I showed up." "Exactly," Aiden said, patting her head. "And you've become our greatest treasure." Caitlin looked at her husband with warmth, but there was a shadow of something inexplicable in her gaze, barely noticeable. But Aiden, busy with the pickup, did not notice it. He was too immersed in the moment, in their little family, in the feeling that everything was okay. After breakfast, Aiden led Sophie out to the backyard workshop, where they continued to tinker with the truck. Caitlin stayed inside, working on a new project, a logo for a local cafe. Her laptop was littered with sketches, and the screen was filled with bright lines as she drew them with practiced ease. But every now and then, she glanced out the window, watching Aiden and Sophie. Her smile was genuine, but there was a worry in the corners of her eyes that she tried hard to hide. "Mom, come here," Sophie shouted, waving a toy key. "We've almost fixed the car." Caitlin walked out onto the porch, holding a glass of lemonade. "Almost?" She raised an eyebrow at Aiden. "So, in a year, we're finally going to the lake?" "In a year?" Aiden pretended to be offended. "I'll have it running by next week. Sophie, tell her we're the best mechanics in Austin." "The best," Sophie said proudly, placing her hands on her hips. "Mom, you just don't understand how this works." Caitlin laughed, but her laugh was a little quieter than usual. She sat down next to Sophie, handing her the lemonade. "Well, if you're such masters, then I can't wait for us to go for a ride. Just don't forget to buckle me up tight, because I know how your dad drives." "Hey, I'm a great driver," Aiden countered, giving her a mocking look. "You almost drove into a dumpster that time." Once, Caitlin raised a finger, but her eyes sparkled with amusement. And it was a very sneaky tank. They continued to tease each other until Sophie ran off to play with a ball, giggling. Aiden watched his daughter, feeling his heart fill with warmth. He loved those days when everything seemed simple and right. Working in the workshop was exhausting, but coming home to Caitlin and Sophie always recharged him. He couldn't imagine life without them. By evening, the family had gathered for dinner. The table was simple: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and a salad that Caitlin proudly called "my masterpiece." Sophie chatted about how they drew animals in school and how her drawing of an elephant turned out to be the most elephantine. Aiden listened, nodding and refilling his daughter's juice, while Caitlin told them about the new order from the cafe. They wanted something bright, but not flashy, she said, cutting into a chicken. "I suggested a logo with a coffee cup that looks like it's smiling. It sounds silly, but they liked it." "Not stupid," Aiden said, taking a bite. "You always do cool stuff. Remember that banner for the fair? Everyone was talking about it." Caitlin smiled, but her gaze flickered again. Aiden noticed it this time, but chalked it up to fatigue. She'd been working a lot lately, and he figured he should give her a day off. "Maybe next Sunday we'll go to the lake," he suggested. "Even if the pickup isn't ready, we'll go in my work car." "Hooray!" Sophie threw her hands up, almost knocking over her glass. "Dad, can I borrow a fishing rod? I want to catch a fish like you." "Of course, little star," Aiden smiled. "But keep in mind, fish are cunning. You'll need to practice." Caitlin nodded, but her smile was strained. She quickly changed the subject, asking Sophie about school, and dinner continued as usual. After dinner, Aiden put Sophie to bed, reading her a story about pirates until she fell asleep with her plush teddy bear. He kissed her forehead, turned off the light, and returned to the living room. Caitlin sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Aiden plopped down next to her, putting his hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking at her. "You're so quiet today." "I'm just tired," she replied, without looking up. "This order is exhausting. I'll finish soon, and then it will be easier." Morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the wooden floor of the living room. Aiden Brooks stood by the window, sipping coffee from an old ceramic mug, watching Sophie kick a ball around the yard. Her tinkling laughter echoed in the morning silence, drowning out the distant hum of the neighbor's lawn mower. He smiled, but his mind was elsewhere. The night before, when Caitlin had seemed unusually quiet, had left him slightly uneasy. She had chalked it up to fatigue, but Aiden knew her too well. Something was wrong. Dad, look, I'm almost like Ronaldo, Sophie shouted, kicking the ball so hard that it flew into the bushes. She ran after it, tripping over her shoelaces. Hey, Star, tie your sneakers before you turn into Ronaldo with a bump on your forehead, Aiden called, setting his mug on the windowsill. He turned to the table where a stack of bills and letters lay, which he had promised to sort last week. It was time to get some work done before Caitlin returned from her morning run. He sat down at his desk, rubbing his temples. Working at the auto shop was grueling, but Aiden loved the simplicity of it. If your car broke down, fix it, no mystery. Unlike Bill's, which always found a way to irritate him. He began sorting through the letters, the electric bill, an ad for the new gym, an invitation to Sophie's school dance. But one letter stood out, a plain white envelope with no return address, just his name, written in neat handwriting, Aiden Brooks. Aiden frowned, turning the envelope over in his hands. No stamps, no postmarks. Someone had clearly dropped it straight into his mailbox. He tore it open, expecting another flyer, but instead pulled out a folded piece of paper and a photograph. His heart sank. It was of Caitlin, younger, with her hair long and not pulled back into its usual bun. She was sitting in a cafe across from a man Aiden didn't know. They were smiling, their heads slightly tilted toward each other, as if sharing a secret. The date on the back of the photograph read June 2018, 7 years ago, a year before Sophie was born. Aiden unfolded the paper. There were just 3 words written in the same handwriting. Ask her about Sophie. His fingers froze, and a heavy feeling began to build in his chest. He reread the note, hoping it was some kind of mistake, a joke. But the words did not change. He looked at the photo again, studying Caitlin's face. She looked happy, carefree, just like he remembered her before the wedding. And the man. Who the hell was he? Dad, why are you so serious? Sophie ran into the living room, her cheeks flushed from running. She was holding a ball covered in dirt. Aiden quickly shoved the letter and photo into his jeans pocket, forcing a smile. Oh, just thinking, little star. Want to make some sandwiches? Mom will need something to eat after her run soon. With peanut butter, Sophie beamed, oblivious to his odd mood. As long as you don't smear it on my nose like last time, Aiden winked, standing up. He led her into the kitchen, trying to keep his voice even, but his mind was racing with questions. Who had dropped off the letter? What did it mean? And why the hell had Caitlin never mentioned this guy? In the kitchen, Sophie climbed onto a chair, swinging her legs while Aiden got out bread and a jar of peanut butter. He tried to focus on her prattling on about how she wanted to learn how to do a backflip, but his mind kept drifting back to the letter. He felt something dark brewing inside him, but he pushed it away. Not now, not with Sophie around. Dad, can you do a somersault? Sophie asked, spreading butter on her bread so hard that the piece almost broke. At my age, Aiden grinned, trying to distract himself. I tried it once, back in school. Fell right on my back. Everyone laughed, and I walked around like an old man for a week. Sophie giggled at the thought. Does Mom know how? Mom? Aiden thought, remembering Caitlin in college. She was more of a dance person. I remember her teaching everyone a dance at a dorm party. I just watched and thought, how did I even talk to that girl? Because you're cool, Sophie said, pointing her finger proudly into the air. Aiden laughed, but it was strained. He heard the front door open, and Caitlin was back. She walked into the kitchen, her sneakers squeaking on the floor. Her face was flushed, her hair plastered to her forehead. Oh, sandwiches, she said, smiling at Sophie. You two are spoiling me. It's all Sophie, Aiden said, trying to sound casual. She's the head chef here. Caitlin patted her daughter's head and looked at Aiden. Her smile was warm, but he noticed her eyes quickly slid over his face, as if searching for something. Was your run a success? He asked, taking out another piece of bread. Yeah, 5 miles, Caitlin replied, taking off her sneakers. I feel like I can move mountains. Then maybe you could help me with the pickup, Aiden winked, but his voice was a little sharper than he intended. Caitlin narrowed her eyes, catching the change in his tone. Is something wrong? She asked, pouring herself some water. Nothing, he answered quickly, turning away to the sink. It's just a long day. She nodded, but her eyes lingered on him a little longer than usual. Aiden could feel the letter in his pocket burning into his skin. He wanted to ask her right then to put the photo on the table, but Sophie was sitting next to him, humming a song and spreading butter on her bread. Not the time, not the place. The rest of the morning passed in the usual rhythm. Sophie dragged Caitlin into the living room to show her the new painting, a bright splash of color depicting their family by the lake. Aiden stayed in the kitchen, washing the dishes with more force than necessary. His thoughts swirled around the photograph. Who was this man? Why had Caitlin never mentioned him? And what did she mean? Ask her about Sophie. He tried to remember what had happened 7 years ago. He and Caitlin had just started living together, planning their wedding. There had been arguments, of course all couples do, but nothing serious. Or was there something he hadn't noticed? Around lunchtime, Aiden decided to take a break and took Sophie to the park. She was running around the playground, swinging on the swings and shouting, "Dad, look, I'm flying." Aiden sat on a bench, watching her, but his eyes kept wandering to his phone. He wanted to call Liam, his brother, to tell him about the letter, but he decided against it. Liam would be too direct. Just ask her, man. Why drag it out? But Aiden wasn't ready. Not now. "Dad, push me!" Sophie shouted from the swing. Aiden stood up, shoving his hands into his pockets, where his fingers found the folded letter again. He forced a smile and walked over to his daughter, pushing the swing. "Higher?" he asked. "Higher to the sky," Sophie squealed, her curls fluttering in the wind. He pushed the swing, listening to her laugh, but one question was spinning in his head. What was Caitlin hiding? He remembered her face in the photograph, so happy, so unfamiliar. They had been together for 7 years, married, and had Sophie. He thought he knew her, but now he wasn't sure. When Aiden returned home, he found Caitlin at her laptop. She was working on another sketch, her fingers moving quickly across the graphics tablet. Sophie ran off to her room to play, and Aiden sat across from his wife, fiddling with a mug in his hands. "Kate," he began, trying to keep his voice even. "You seemed different yesterday. Are you sure everything's okay?" She looked up, her smile slightly strained. "I told you, I'm tired," she replied, looking away. "This order is exhausting. I'll be done soon." "Yeah," Aiden nodded, but his fingers tightened around his mug. "It's just, if something was wrong, you'd tell me, right?" Caitlin looked at him, her green eyes frozen for a second. "Of course," she said quietly. "You know I always tell you everything." Aiden nodded, but something inside him tightened. He wanted to take out the letter, show her the photograph, ask who this man was and what she was hiding. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he stood up and said, "I'll go check the pickup. I need to finish with the carburetor." Caitlin nodded, turning back to her work, but Aiden noticed her shoulders tense slightly. He walked out into the yard, where the truck was parked under a canopy, and popped the hood. But his hands moved automatically. His mind was elsewhere. Rain pounded the roof of the house, filling the living room with a monotonous noise. Aiden Brooks sat on the couch, clutching a bottle of beer that he hadn't opened. On the coffee table in front of him was an anonymous letter, neatly folded, but the photo of Caitlin with a stranger was unfolded, like a silent reproach. It had been a day since he'd found the letter, and he'd tried to act normal that day, fussing over Sophie, joking with her over dinner, even helping Caitlin with the dishes. But now that Sophie was asleep in her room and Caitlin was showering, he couldn't put it off any longer. It was time to talk. Aiden stood up and paced the room, trying to collect his thoughts. His heart was pounding, and there was a lump in his throat. He didn't know what to expect from this conversation, but he felt like their lives were about to change forever. He glanced at the photo Caitlin, laughing, with this man he'd never met. 7 years ago. What was she hiding, and why would someone show him this? The bathroom door opened and Caitlin came out, drying her hair with a towel. She was wearing Aiden's old t-shirt and shorts. Her face was bare, tired but calm. She looked at him and froze, noticing his tense posture. "Aiden," she said, lowering the towel. "What's wrong? Bills again." He shook his head, his fingers tightening around the photograph. He hadn't meant to start so abruptly, but the words just came out. "Kate, we need to talk," he said, his voice firm but shaking inside. "Sit down." Caitlin frowned, her brows knitting together, but she sat down obediently on the couch, putting the towel aside. Her green eyes looked at him intently, and Aiden saw the worry in them. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft but slightly trembling. "You're scaring me." Aiden took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. He pulled out the photograph and placed it on the table in front of her, next to the note. Caitlin looked at the picture, and her face paled. She froze, her fingers clenching into fists. "Where did you get this?" she asked quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "You tell me," Aiden said, his tone sharpening. "Someone dropped this in our mailbox. With a note. Ask her about Sophie." "What is it, Kate? Who is this guy?" Caitlin stared at the photograph, her lips trembling. She didn't look up, and the silence killed Aiden. He waited, hoping she would say it was a mistake, that it was an old friend, that none of this meant anything. But her silence was louder than any words. "Kate," he said, his voice growing louder. "Speak, now." She finally looked up at him, and Aiden saw tears in her eyes. Her hands shook as she reached for the photograph, but stopped short of touching it. "It's—" she began, her voice breaking. "It was a long time ago, Aiden, 7 years ago, before our wedding." "Who is he?" Aiden stepped closer, his fists clenching. "And what do you mean? Ask her about Sophie." Caitlin closed her eyes, her breathing becoming ragged. She swallowed, as if trying to get rid of a lump in her throat, and spoke, her voice barely audible. "His name is Nate. We went to college together. It was a mistake. A short, stupid mistake." Aiden felt the floor slipping from under his feet as he looked at her, trying to process her words. "A mistake?" he asked, his voice shaking with anger. "You slept with him, Kate? You call that a mistake?" Caitlin winced, tears streaming down her cheeks. She nodded without looking at him. "Yes," she whispered. "It was once. We had a fight, remember? You went away for a week to see Liam, and I was in such a state. I didn't know what I was doing." Aiden remembered that fight. It had been a month before their wedding, when they had argued about money, where to live, and the future. He had gone to his brother's to cool off, and when he returned, Caitlin was herself cheerful, loving. He had thought they had worked it out, and now. "So?" His voice was cold, almost alien. "You just went and slept with some guy, and didn't tell me? 7 years, Kate? 7 fucking years." I wanted to say, she looked up, her voice shaking. "I really did. But then we made up, and everything was so good, and I didn't want to ruin it." Aiden laughed, but it was a bitter, almost evil laugh. "Didn't want to ruin it. What do you think this is?" He pointed at the photo. "And what do you mean? Ask her about Sophie. Kate, tell me this isn't what I think it is." Caitlin clapped her hand to her mouth, her tears streaming faster. She was silent, and that silence was worse than any answer. Aiden felt his heart squeeze, as if someone was squeezing it in a vice. "Kate," he said, his voice quieter but still steely. "Sophie is my daughter, or have you kept that from me too?" She shook her head, her voice breaking into a sob. "I don't know, Aiden. I swear I don't know. It was one time, and I didn't think. I didn't think it could be." She trailed off, covering her face with her hands. Aiden stepped back as if struck. His mind refused to accept her words. Sophie, his little star, the girl he had rocked in his arms, read stories to, whose drawings hung on the refrigerator, could she not be his? He looked at Caitlin, and she seemed alien. The woman he had loved, the woman he had built a life with, was now a stranger. "You don't know?" he asked, his voice shaking with rage and pain. "You don't know whose daughter she is? How could you keep this quiet, Kate? How could you look me in the eye every day, knowing you might be lying?" "I was afraid," she whispered, her voice full of despair. I was afraid I'd lose you, that I'd lose us. I love you, Aiden. I've always loved you. Loved? He was almost shouting now. You call this love? You lied to me, Kate. You let me raise Sophie without knowing if she was mine or not. How could you? Caitlin jumped up, her hands shaking as she stepped toward him. I didn't mean for this to happen, she cried, her voice full of tears. I wanted to forget about it, to pretend it never happened. I thought I could, because you're Sophie's father. You've always been her father, Aiden, no matter. Don't you dare, he cut her off, his voice cold as ice. Don't you dare tell me it doesn't matter. You don't know whose daughter she is, and you kept quiet. You stole the truth from me. Caitlin collapsed back onto the couch, her sobs filling the room. Aiden watched her, feeling his world crumble. He wanted to leave, to slam the door, to disappear, but his feet were rooted to the floor. He thought of Sophie, asleep upstairs, her curls, her laugh. She was his everything, and the thought that she might not be his tore him apart. We need a DNA test, he said finally, his voice hoarse. I have to know. Caitlin nodded without looking up. Okay, she whispered. I agree. I'll do whatever you want. Aiden turned and walked out of the living room without another word. He walked up to the porch, where the rain was still pounding the awning. He pulled a cigarette from the pack he hadn't touched in months and lit it, staring into the darkness. The smoke burned his lungs, but he felt no relief, only emptiness and pain. He knew this conversation was just the beginning, and no matter what the test showed, their lives would never be the same. Dark clouds gathered over Austin, mirroring the storm raging inside Aiden Brooks. He sat in his old pickup truck, parked on the side of the road not far from his house, gripping the steering wheel as if it could hold his world together. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a damp, wet pavement smell, but Aiden was oblivious to everything around him. His thoughts were on Caitlin, her tears, her confession, her words, I don't know. Those three words echoed in his head, each time adding to the ache in his chest. Sophie, his little star, might not be his, and he couldn't live with that uncertainty. A day had passed since their fight, and Aiden hadn't returned home. He'd spent the night in the workshop, on the old couch in the lounge, surrounded by the smell of oil and metal. He didn't want to see Caitlin, didn't want to hear her excuses, but he knew he had to do something. A DNA test was the only way to find out the truth, and even though the thought of it felt like a betrayal of Sophie, he saw no other way. Aiden pulled out his phone and dialed Liam, his brother. Liam answered on the second ring, his voice as cheerful as ever. Hey, bro, where have you been? Sophie was asking why you didn't show up to her soccer practice yesterday, Liam said, a hint of concern in his tone. Aiden swallowed, his voice hoarse. Liam, I need to talk. Not on the phone. Can you meet? Sure, Liam said, his expression serious. I'm at the coffee shop. Come over and I'll make you something stronger than espresso. Half an hour later, Aiden was sitting at the counter of Bean Around, Liam's coffee shop, a small, cozy place with wooden tables and the smell of freshly ground beans. Liam, in his usual plaid shirt, was wiping down the counter, but his eyes were fixed on his brother. Aiden looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Dark circles under his eyes, stubble, his shirt wrinkled. Well, spit it out, Liam said, setting a mug of black coffee in front of him. What happened? You look like you've been run over by a truck. Aiden pulled the photograph and note out of his pocket and placed them on the counter, his fingers shaking as he smoothed the paper. I found this in the mailbox yesterday, he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. Caitlin, she admitted she had an affair, 7 years ago, before her wedding, with someone named Nate, and she doesn't know if it's my Sophie or his. Liam froze, his hand holding the rag still. He looked at the photo, then at Aiden, his brows furrowing. Shit, Aiden, he breathed. Are you serious? Caitlin? Our Caitlin? Yes, Aiden clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. She's been silent all this time. 7 years, Liam. I thought I knew her. And now, I don't know who she is. Liam whistled, shaking his head. He poured himself a coffee and sat down across from his brother. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice cautious but firm. "You're not just showing me this." Aiden took a sip of his coffee, but the taste was as bitter as his thoughts. "I told her we need a DNA test," he replied. "I need to know, Liam. I can't live without knowing if Sophie is mine or not." Liam nodded, but his face was serious. "I understand. But brother, are you sure you want this? What if?" He hesitated, choosing his words. "What if she's not yours? What then?" Aiden gritted his teeth, his gaze fixed on the counter. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't just pretend it didn't happen. I look at Sophie, and all I see is her smile, her curls, her daddy, push me on the swing. But now I think, what if she's not mine? And that thought, it kills me." Liam placed his hand on his brother's shoulder, squeezing it. "Aiden, listen. Sophie is your daughter. You raised her, you rocked her to sleep when she cried at night, you taught her to ride a bike. This is all you. Some test is not going to change the fact that you are her father." "Maybe so," Aiden said, his voice shaking. "But I have to know the truth. I can't live with that maybe. And Caitlin, I don't know how to look at her now." Liam sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Okay, if you've decided, I'll support you. But how are you going to pull it off? These tests aren't quick." "I already found the clinic," Aiden said, taking out his phone. "They do paternity tests. They just need to take samples from me and Sophie." Caitlin agreed. "What about Sophie?" Liam frowned. "Are you going to tell her?" Aiden shook his head, his face darkening. "No, she shouldn't know. She's too young to understand. I'll say it's just a medical test, for school or something." Liam nodded, but there was concern in his eyes. "Just be careful, brother. This could all go off like a bomb. And not just for you and Caitlin, for Sophie too." Aiden was silent, looking at the photo. He knew Liam was right, but there was no turning back. He had to know. When Aiden returned home that evening, he found Caitlin in the kitchen. She was cooking dinner, but her movements were mechanical, as if she was performing the task on autopilot. Sophie was in the living room, watching cartoons, her laughter coming through the open door. Aiden paused in the doorway, looking at his wife. "I spoke to Liam," he said, his voice even but cold. "I found a clinic. They do DNA tests. I'll make an appointment tomorrow." Caitlin froze, her knife hovering over the cutting board. She turned slowly, her eyes red, as if she had been crying. "Okay," she said quietly. "What do I need to do?" "Nothing," Aiden said, his tone sharp. "I'll arrange it myself. We'll need samples, mine and Sophie's. I'll tell her it's for the medical record." Caitlin nodded, her lips trembling. "Aiden, she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "Don't, Kate," he said. "I don't want to hear excuses. Not now." She lowered her head, her fingers gripping the edge of the tabletop. "I just want you to know," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen. I love you. And Sophie." Aiden looked at her, anger and pain warring in his chest. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to remember the woman he loved, but all he saw was the lie she had kept for 7 years. "Love doesn't lie, Kate," he said finally, his voice quiet but heavy. "I don't know how we're going to move forward, but first, I need to know the truth about Sophie." He turned and walked into the living room, where Sophie was sitting on the couch, hugging her teddy bear. She looked at him and smiled. "Dad, this is funny. This penguin fell into the water," she said, pointing at the screen. Aiden forced a smile as he sat down next to her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and felt her warm little body pressed against his. His heart clenched. No matter what the test showed, Sophie was his daughter. But he had to know. For her sake, for myself. "Funny penguin, little star," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Tell me what else he's done." As Sophie chatted about the cartoon, Aiden looked at her, trying to remember this moment. Tomorrow he will call the clinic. Tomorrow he would take a step that would change everything. But today, he just wanted to be her dad. The streetlights glinted off the puddles on the asphalt as Aiden Brooks drove through the deserted streets of Austin. His truck, still incompletely fixed, creaked as he turned, but Aiden barely noticed. His hands gripped the wheel, his eyes glued to the road, his mind elsewhere. It had been 2 days since he demanded the DNA test, and every hour in the house with Caitlin was becoming unbearable. Her tears, her attempts to talk, her guilty eyes, it was all like salt in a wound. He couldn't stay there, couldn't pretend everything was okay when his world was falling apart. Aiden pulled up outside a small brick house on the outskirts of town. It was the flat of his friend Tom, a mechanic at the shop who often offered to let Aiden stay put if things went wrong. Aiden never thought he'd take him up on that offer. He pulled a duffel bag containing a couple of changes of clothes and an old sleeping bag out of the trunk, glancing up at the dark windows of the house. Sophie was staying with Caitlin, and the thought of not seeing her that evening made his heart clench. Tom opened the door after the first knock, his bearded face breaking into a surprised smile. "Hey, Brooks, did you run away from home?" he said, stepping aside to let Aiden pass. "I thought you were going to whine about your pickup truck again." Aiden tried to smile, but it came out crooked. "I need a couple of days, Tom," he said, throwing his bag on the floor. "Can I stay with you?" Tom narrowed his eyes, picking up on the tension in his friend's voice. He nodded toward the couch in the corner of the small living room, littered with old magazines and pizza boxes. "Sure, dude, the couch is yours, but are you going to tell me what happened, or should I guess?" Aiden collapsed on the couch, rubbing his face with his hands. Tom's apartment was cramped and smelled of coffee and motor oil, but it felt like a sanctuary, a place where he could get away from whatever was waiting for him at home. He pulled the photo and note out of his pocket, tossing them onto the coffee table. "Caitlin," he began, his voice hoarse. She had an affair 7 years ago, and she doesn't know if Sophie is mine or not." Tom whistled as he sat down opposite. He picked up the photograph and looked at it. "Damn, Aiden. This is serious. What are you going to do?" "DNA test," Aiden said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I've already made an appointment at the clinic. We'll take samples tomorrow. But I can't be home, Tom. I can't look at her. I can't pretend everything's okay." Tom nodded, his face becoming serious. "I understand. But what about Sophie? It's not her fault." Aiden clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "I know," he said quietly. "She's my little star. But every time I see her, I think, what if she's not mine? And it kills me." Tom leaned back in his chair, rubbing his beard. "Look, I'm no expert on family matters, but Sophie adores you. You're her dad, Aiden. Test or no test, it doesn't change what you mean to her." Aiden nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Sophie, about how she had hugged him before bed last night, holding him like her teddy bear. He couldn't tell her the truth, couldn't explain why his dad had suddenly become so distant. But he also couldn't stay in a house where every corner reminded him of Caitlin's betrayal. "I'll talk to her tomorrow," he said finally. "After the clinic. I don't want her to think I've abandoned her." Tom clapped him on the shoulder, his voice warm. "You'll do it right, Brooks. In the meantime, make yourself comfortable. Want a beer?" Aiden shook his head. "No, thanks. I need to. Just think." Tom nodded and went into the kitchen, leaving Aiden alone. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. No Sophie's laughter, no familiar noises from the house, no Caitlin's voice humming as she worked. Aiden lay down on the couch, staring at the ceiling. His gaze fell on the photograph he'd left on the table. Caitlin, laughing with Nate. He closed his eyes, but the image wouldn't go away. The next day, Aiden came home to take Sophie to the clinic. He tried to keep his cool, but every step across the familiar courtyard was like a blow. Caitlin opened the door, her face pale, her eyes puffy from crying. She looked like she hadn't slept. "Aiden," she began, her voice shaking. Are you coming home after this?" He looked at her, anger seething in his chest. "I don't know, Kate," he said coldly. "I can't think about it now." She nodded, looking down. Sophie ran out of the living room, her curls bouncing. "Dad," she cried, rushing towards him. "Are we going for a ride?" Aiden forced a smile as he leaned down to hug her. "Not exactly, Star," he said, trying to sound light. "We need to stop somewhere for school. They want to check that you're okay." Sophie wrinkled her nose. "Are these injections? I don't like injections." "No injections," Aiden promised, though his heart sank. "Just a little spit, like in the scientist game. You like being a scientist, right?" Sophie beamed. "Yeah, I'll be like the doctor from the cartoon." Caitlin stood to the side, watching them. Her arms were crossed, as if she was trying to keep herself from speaking. Aiden wasn't looking at her. He took Sophie's hand and led her to the truck. At the clinic, everything went quickly. The nurse, a kind woman with a bright smile, took swabs from Aiden and Sophie's mouths, explaining it as if it were a game. Sophie chattered away, telling the nurse about her teddy bear, and Aiden was grateful for her nonchalance. But every time he looked at her, his mind wandered back to the test. What if she wasn't his? What then? "Dad, can I have some ice cream after this?" Sophie asked as they left the clinic. Aiden smiled, though it was difficult for him to do so. "Of course, Star. Which one do you want?" "Chocolate, with sprinkles," she declared, jumping up and down. They stopped at a nearby ice cream parlor, and Aiden watched Sophie happily eat her ice cream, smearing chocolate all over her cheeks. He tried to remember the moment, her laugh, her bright eyes, her absolute belief that Daddy would always be there. But deep down, he felt fear clutching at his heart. Back at Tom's apartment, Aiden collapsed on the couch. Tom was on shift, and the silence was deafening. He pulled out his phone and saw a text from Caitlin. "Aiden, please talk to me. I know I'm wrong, but I want to make it right." He deleted the message without replying. He wasn't ready. Not now. Lying in the dark, Aiden thought about Sophie, about how she'd held his hand in the clinic, how she'd called him Daddy. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he saw Caitlin's face in the photo, smiling with another man. And the note, "Ask her about Sophie." He knew the test would give an answer, but he was afraid that the answer would ruin everything he loved. Liam's bean-around coffee shop was buzzing with the morning bustle, filling the air with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm croissants. Aiden Brooks sat at a corner table by the window, away from the busy counter where Liam deftly served customers. The morning sun was streaming through the display case, casting warm pools of light across the wooden floor, but Aiden barely noticed. His fingers fidgeted nervously with the rim of his paper cup, his eyes glued to the phone in front of him. He waited for the clinic to call to confirm that the DNA samples had been received, but every hour without news felt like an eternity. It had been a week since he had left home, leaving Caitlin and Sophie to sort out his thoughts. Tom's flat had become a temporary refuge, but its cramped walls and silence only served to increase his anxiety. He had seen Sophie yesterday, taking her to the football, and her smile, her "Dad, watch me kick," had torn his heart out. She was unaware of the chaos that was raging inside him, and Aiden was doing everything he could to keep it that way. But he couldn't shake the question that was nagging at him. Whose daughter was she? Liam, wiping his hands on his apron, finally pulled himself free and walked over to his brother's table. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his expression was a mixture of worry and determination. He plopped down in the chair opposite, placing a fresh croissant in front of Aiden. "You look like you haven't slept since last week," Liam said, squinting. "Eat, and tell me what's going on." Aiden pushed the croissant away without looking at it. His voice was quiet, almost lifeless. "I gave samples to the clinic, mine and Sophie's. They said the results would be back in a couple of weeks." He paused, clutching the cup so tightly that the paper crumpled. "I don't know how I'm going to live until then, Liam." Liam leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, his face serious, but his eyes full of sympathy. "Damn, brother," he said. "It's like living with a ticking bomb. But you cope. You always cope." Aiden smiled bitterly, shaking his head. "Coping. I'm sleeping on Tom's couch, avoiding Caitlin like the plague, and every time I see Sophie, I either want to hug her or scream at her, because I don't know the truth. That's not coping, Liam. That's falling into the abyss. Liam leaned forward, his voice firmer. Look, Aiden, I know you're in hell right now, but you can't let this break you. Sophie needs you. No matter what this test says, you're her dad. You were there when she was born, when she took her first step, when she fell off the swing and bruised her knee. This is all you. Aiden looked out the window at the people going about their business. His fingers still fiddled with his cup, but he nodded. I know, he said quietly, but I can't just pretend nothing's changed. Caitlin, she lied to me, Liam. For 7 years, she looked me in the eye, smiled, made plans, and all the while she knew Sophie might not be mine. How am I supposed to live with that? Liam sighed, rubbing his chin. I'm not making excuses for Caitlin, he said. What she did was mean, but I see her with Sophie. She loves her. And you. Maybe she's just confused, scared. People do stupid things when they're scared. Scared? Aiden raised his voice, drawing the eyes of the couple at the next table. He lowered his tone, but his words were bitter. She's not just confused, Liam. She slept with some guy and kept quiet about it. And now I have to wait for a test to tell me if she's my daughter or not. That's not fear. That's betrayal. Liam nodded without arguing. He knew when to keep quiet. Instead, he stood up, got another coffee, and set it in front of Aiden. Okay, he said. You're angry, and you have every right to be. But let's think about Sophie for a second. She doesn't know anything, does she? Aiden shook his head, his face softening at the mention of his daughter. No, and I don't want her to know. She's too young. I told her the test was just for school, for her medical record. She believed me. Okay, Liam said. Then keep it a secret until you know the truth. But Aiden, no matter what the test says, you have to decide what's important to you. Sophie adores you. Did you see her screaming at the football yesterday for you to watch? This isn't about DNA. This is about you. Aiden was silent, looking at his coffee. He remembered Sophie running up to him after practice yesterday, her curls bouncing, holding the bottle of water he'd forgotten on the bench. Dad, you forgot to drink again, she said, thrusting the bottle into his hands. The coach says you have to drink water, otherwise you'll end up like a dry cactus. He laughed then, hugged her, feeling her small hands squeeze his neck. She was his little star, his everything. But the thought that she might not be his by blood was like a knife in his chest. I don't know how I'm going to live without her, Aiden admitted, his voice breaking. But I also don't know how I'm going to live with Caitlin after this. She ruined everything, Liam. Everything we built. Liam leaned closer, his voice firm but soft. You don't have to decide everything now. One step at a time, brother. First the test. Then you can deal with Caitlin. But don't push Sophie away. It's not her fault. Aiden nodded, but his thoughts were chaotic. He knew Liam was right, but his anger and pain were making it hard to think clearly. He wanted to believe that his love for Sophie was stronger than any test, but the uncertainty was suffocating him. I'm trying, he said finally, but every time I see her, I see Caitlin, and that damn picture, and that Nate. Liam frowned. Who is this Nate anyway? Do you know anything about him? Aiden shook his head. Just what Caitlin said. A classmate. They dated a couple times before me, then broke up. And then when we had a fight before the wedding, He trailed off, clenching his fists. She didn't go into detail, and I didn't want to listen. Maybe we should find out, Liam suggested. If this guy decides to show up, we better be prepared. Aiden gritted his teeth. The thought of this Nate claiming Sophie was unbearable. If he shows up, I'll deal with him, he said, his voice cold. But right now, I just have to live until the test results come back. Liam nodded, clapping his brother on the shoulder. You'll survive. You're stronger than you think. And Aiden, if anything happens, I'm here. Always. Aiden smiled weakly, feeling a little relief for the first time that morning. Liam had always been his anchor, straightforward but reliable. He finished his coffee, looking out the window. Outside, Sophie would be playing with a ball if he were home. He imagined her curls, her laughter, and his heart clenched. He had to hold on for her. "I'm going to the workshop," he said, standing up. "I need a break." "Thanks, Liam." "You're welcome," Liam replied, returning to the counter. "And Aiden, remember to breathe, okay?" Aiden nodded. The dim light of Tom's apartment cast long shadows on the peeling walls as Aiden Brooks sat on the edge of the sagging couch, staring at the envelope in his hands. It was plain and white, with the clinic's logo in the corner, but its weight seemed unbearable. It had been 2 weeks since he had given his DNA samples, and now the answer lay before him, sealed like a death warrant. His fingers trembled as he ran them along the edge of the envelope, hesitating to open it. The silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of traffic outside the window and the creaking of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. Aiden lay awake last night, running through all the possible outcomes in his head. He imagined opening the envelope and seeing that Sophie was his daughter, and relief would wash over him like a warm wave. But then his thoughts would turn into a dark corner. What if she wasn't his? What if everything he knew about his life was built on a lie? He thought of Sophie, her curls, her laugh, her "daddy, look," and felt his heart clench. He didn't know how he would live with any of those answers. The phone on the table vibrated, startling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Caitlin. "Have you got the results? Please talk to me." Aiden gritted his teeth, ignoring the message. He hadn't seen her since that day at the clinic, communicating only with short messages about Sophie. She had tried calling, texting, asking to meet, but he wasn't ready. Her betrayal still burned like an open wound, and he didn't know how to look her in the eye without losing his composure. He glanced at the photograph of Sophie on the table, a snapshot from last year's trip to the lake, where she'd held up a fish she'd caught and smiled proudly. Aiden picked it up, his thumb stroking her smiling face. "You're my little star," he whispered, his voice breaking. He had to know the truth, but he was afraid it would tear him apart. There was a knock at the door and Aiden jumped, almost dropping the envelope. He stood up, stuffing it into the back pocket of his jeans, and opened the door. Liam, his brother, stood there, holding a bag from his coffee shop in one hand and a worried expression on his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Liam said, walking in uninvited. He dropped the bag on the table that smelled of fresh buns. "Got the results?" Aiden nodded, pulling an envelope out of his pocket. He held it as if it were a bomb. "It came this morning," he said hoarsely. "I haven't opened it yet." Liam whistled, sitting down on the chair opposite the sofa, his dark eyes studying his brother carefully. "Shit, Aiden. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff. Do you want me here when you open it?" Aiden looked at him, his face tense. "I don't know," he admitted. "I want to open it, but I'm scared, Liam. If she's not mine, I don't know what I'll do." Liam leaned forward, his voice firm but soft. "Look, brother, whatever's in that envelope, Sophie is your daughter. You raised her, you loved her, you were there every damn day. It's not a piece of paper that defines who you are to her." Aiden nodded, but his fingers were still clutching the envelope. He knew Liam was right, but that didn't take the weight off his shoulders. He sat back down on the couch, placing the envelope on the table between them. "I can't wait any longer," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I have to know." Liam nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Then open up. I'm here." Aiden took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed with tables and percentages. His eyes scanned the lines until they landed on the last one. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Sophie was his daughter, his biological daughter. He exhaled as if all the air had left his lungs. His shoulders slumped and he closed his eyes, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. But the relief was immediately followed by another wave: anger, pain, betrayal. Sophie was his, but Caitlin had lied anyway. She had allowed him to doubt, to live with this uncertainty, and it hurt almost as much as if the test had shown otherwise. "Well?" Liam leaned forward, his voice cautious. "What is it?" Aiden handed him the paper without looking at it. "She's mine," he said, his voice hoarse. "Sophie is mine." Liam took the paper, quickly scanning the text. His face broke into a smile, and he clapped Aiden on the shoulder. "Damn it, brother, that's good news," he said. "You should be happy." Aiden shook his head, his gaze fixed on the photo of Sophie. "I'm happy," he said quietly. "But that doesn't change what Caitlin did. She lied, Liam. She let me think Sophie might not be mine. How am I supposed to live with that?" Liam sighed, putting the paper down. "I know it sucks," he said, "but now you have an answer. Sophie is yours. That's all that matters. The rest, you'll figure it out." Aiden stood up, pacing the room. His thoughts were chaotic, anger warring with relief. He thought about Caitlin, her tears, her excuses. He wanted to forgive her, wanted to go back to their life as a family, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her in that picture with Nate. "I can't go home," he said finally, stopping at the window. "Not after this. I want a divorce." Liam froze, his eyebrows raised. "Aiden, are you sure?" he asked. "This is a big step. And Sophie?" "Sophie will stay with me," Aiden said, his voice firm. "I won't leave her. But I can't live with Caitlin. Not after the way she betrayed me." Liam nodded, but his face was serious. "Okay? But divorce is not just a piece of paper. It will be hard for all of you, especially Sophie. Have you thought about how to explain this to her?" Aiden clenched his fists, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I don't want her to grow up in a house where her parents hate each other. She deserves better." Liam stood up, walking towards his brother. "You're right," he said, "but don't rush. Think, talk to Caitlin. Maybe not about forgiveness, but about how you'll move forward. For Sophie's sake." Aiden nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Sophie, about how she'd hugged him after football yesterday, her little arms wrapped around his neck, and she'd whispered, "You're the best dad." He couldn't lose her, but he also couldn't live with the lie. "I'll talk to her," he said finally, "but not today. Today, I just want to see Sophie." Liam smiled, clapping him on the back. "Then let's go. She's probably already waiting for you to pick her up from training." Aiden nodded, picking up the photo of Sophie from the table. He stuffed it in his pocket, next to the test results, and followed Liam out. As they climbed into the truck, Aiden looked at the empty passenger seat where Sophie usually sat and felt his heart clench. She was his daughter. It was true. The thud of a soccer ball hitting grass echoed across the field where Sophie's junior team was training. Aiden Brooks stood on the sideline, arms crossed, watching his 6-year-old daughter, her curls tucked under her headband, run after the ball. Her tiny trainers flashed across the grass, her face aglow with determination. "Come on, Sophie, shoot!" he shouted as she reached the goal, his voice mixing with the hubbub of the other parents. She missed, but turned to him with a big smile, and Aiden gave him a thumbs up, a warm feeling briefly silencing the storm inside him. It had been a day since he'd gotten the DNA results confirming Sophie was his biological daughter. The relief was enormous, like a breath of air after a long dive, but it didn't ease his anger at Caitlin. Her betrayal, the affair with Nate, her silence still burned like an open wound. Aiden had decided to file for divorce, but he hadn't told Caitlin yet. He wanted to establish a new routine with Sophie first, so she wouldn't feel their world crumbling. Today, standing on the field, he tried to focus on his daughter, but his mind kept returning to that damn photo and the note, "Ask her about Sophie." After training, Sophie ran up to him, her face flushed and her uniform covered in grass. "Dad, did you see how I almost scored?" she exclaimed, throwing herself into his arms. "I saw you, little star," Aiden said, picking her up and spinning her around. "Just a few more practices, and you'll be the star of the team." "How's Messi?" she asked, her eyes shining. "Better than Messi," he winked, setting her down. "Come on, we need to stop by Uncle Liam's. He promised us donuts." Sophie squealed with delight, grabbing his hand. Aiden led her to the truck, trying not to think about what was waiting for him at home, or, more accurately, at Tom's apartment, where he now lived. He glanced at Sophie, prattling on about how the coach had complimented her on a pass, and felt his heart clench. She was his daughter, and that was true, but the truth about Caitlin still rankled. When they arrived at Liam's coffee shop, the bean-around was bustling with evening customers. The smell of freshly ground coffee and baked goods filled the air, and behind the counter, Liam was expertly pouring lattes while chatting with customers. When he saw Aiden and Sophie, he waved, a smile lighting up his face. "Hey, soccer star," he called to Sophie. "Ready for a sprinkle donut?" "Yes," Sophie jumped up, pulling Aiden towards the counter. "With pink sprinkles, Uncle Liam." Liam winked, taking a donut out of the display case and handing it to Sophie. She immediately sat down at a table by the window, enthusiastically taking a bite while Aiden ordered a coffee. Liam, noticing the tension on his face, nodded towards the back room. "Let's go talk," he said quietly, so that Sophie wouldn't hear. Aiden followed his brother into a cramped room filled with boxes of coffee beans. Liam closed the door and turned to face him, crossing his arms. "So, how are you?" he asked. "After the results, I see you're not particularly cheerful." Aiden leaned against the wall, rubbing his neck. "Sophie is mine," he said, his voice quiet. "That's the main thing. But I'm still angry, Liam, at Caitlin, at myself, at all of this." Liam nodded, his gaze serious. "I understand. But have you at least talked to her? About divorce?" "Not yet," Aiden admitted. "I don't know how to begin. Every time I see her, I think of that picture. And that Nate." Liam frowned, opening his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a knock on the door. One of the baristas, a young woman named Mia, poked her head inside. "Liam, there's a guy asking for Caitlin," she said. "He says he has something important to tell her. I told him she's not here, but he insists." Aiden froze, his heart skipping a beat. He looked at Liam, whose face had become tense. "Which guy?" Aiden asked, his voice sharp. Mia shrugged. "I don't know. Tall, with a guitar in a case, said his name was Nate." Aiden felt the blood rush to his face. He clenched his fists, his breathing became heavy. "Nate?" he asked, his voice shaking with anger. "He's here? In your coffee shop?" Liam raised his hands, trying to calm his brother down. "Hey, Aiden, relax. We don't know what he wants. It could just be a coincidence." "Coincidence?" Aiden almost spat the word out. "This bastard slept with my wife, and now he comes here." "No, Liam, it's not a coincidence." He turned towards the door, but Liam grabbed his shoulder. "Don't do anything stupid," he said firmly. "Sophie's over there at the table. Do you want her to see this?" Aiden paused, his chest heaving. He knew Liam was right, but anger bubbled inside him like lava. He nodded, forcing himself to breathe deeply. "Okay," he said through clenched teeth, "but I want to know what he's doing here." Liam went out first, gesturing for Aiden to stay in the back room. He returned a minute later, his face grim. "He left," Liam said. "Left a note for Caitlin. Said he found out about Sophie and wanted to talk. That he couldn't keep quiet." Aiden felt his fists clench even tighter. "Found out about Sophie?" he asked, his voice cold. "What does he even know about my daughter?" Liam handed him the folded piece of paper Nate had left for Caitlin. Aiden unfolded it, his eyes scanning the lines. "Caitlin, I just found out about Sophie. I didn't know before, I swear. We need to talk. It's important. Nate." At the bottom was a phone number. Aiden crumpled the note, his face turning purple. "He wants to be a part of her life," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "After 7 years? After he destroyed my family, who the hell is he?" Liam placed his hand on his shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "Aiden, I know you're mad, but now is not the time. Sophie is there, eating her donut. Go to her. Don't let this guy take this moment away from you." Aiden nodded, but his hands were still shaking. He stuffed the note into his pocket, next to Sophie's photo, and walked out into the hall. Sophie was sitting by the window, her face smeared with pink sprinkles. She looked at him and smiled. "Dad, I saved you a piece," she said, holding out the donut. Aiden forced a smile as he sat down next to her. He took a bite, but it tasted like cardboard. His mind was on Nate, the man he had never met, but who now threatened his world. He looked at Sophie, her bright eyes, her innocent smile, and swore to himself that he would not let anyone, especially Nate, come between them. "Delicious, little star," he said, stroking her head. "The best donut in the world." A warm evening breeze rustled the curtains of Tom's small apartment as Aiden Brooks sat at the rickety kitchen table, sipping cold coffee. On the table in front of him was Sophie's stuffed animal, the plastic dinosaur she'd left in his truck after his last workout. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers absent-mindedly stroking the rough surface, his mind elsewhere. It had been a day since Nate had shown up at Liam's coffee shop, leaving a note that still burned in Aiden's pocket. "I found out about Sophie. We need to talk." The words played in his head like a broken record, fueling the anger he was barely containing. Aiden had been staying with Tom for over a week now, and every day without Sophie was like a knife in his chest. He saw her at practice, picked her up from school, but coming home to an empty apartment reminded him of the rift in their family. Caitlin called, texted, begged him to talk, but his answers were short, only about Sophie's business. Divorce was inevitable. He had decided so when he saw the results of the DNA test confirming Sophie was his daughter. But the relief of the test did not soften the pain of Caitlin's betrayal. And now Nate, the man he hated, even without knowing his face, was threatening to burst into their lives. The doorbell rang, and Aiden jumped, almost dropping the dinosaur. He glanced at his watch, 7 o'clock. It was his turn to pick up Sophie after school, and Caitlin was supposed to drop her off. He stood up, straightened his wrinkled shirt, and opened the door. Sophie was standing in the doorway, her backpack slung over one shoulder, clutching a crayon drawing. Caitlin stood behind him, her face pale, her eyes puffy, but she tried to smile. "Dad," Sophie rushed to him, hugging him around the waist. "I drew a dinosaur, just like yours." Aiden smiled, crouching down to hug her. Her curls tickled his chin, and he inhaled the familiar scent of her baby shampoo. "Cool, star," he said, picking up the drawing. It was of a bright green dinosaur, suspiciously similar to the one on the table, with the words "Daddy's friend" written on it. "Is this dinosaur famous now?" "Yeah," Sophie beamed. "I'll show it at school." Caitlin coughed, her voice quiet. "Aiden, can I come in for a minute?" she asked, her fingers fiddling nervously with the strap of her bag. Aiden tensed, his gaze turning cold. "Not now, Kate," he said, trying to keep his voice even for Sophie's sake. "I'll take her for the weekend, as we agreed." Caitlin nodded, her lips trembling, but she didn't argue. She leaned toward Sophie, kissing her forehead. "Be good, honey," she said. "Call me before you go to bed, okay?" "Okay, Mom," Sophie replied, already distracted by her drawing. Caitlin looked at Aiden, her eyes begging him to talk, but he looked away. She turned and walked toward the car, her steps slow, as if she hoped he would change his mind. Aiden closed the door, anger and pain warring in his chest. He didn't want to see her, didn't want to hear her excuses. But for Sophie, he held on. "Dad, can we watch a cartoon?" Sophie asked, plopping down on Tom's couch. "About dinosaurs." Aiden smiled, trying to push away the dark thoughts. "Of course, starlet," he said, turning on the old television. "But first, dinner. How about some pizza?" "With pepperoni," Sophie exclaimed, jumping up and down on the couch. Aiden ordered a pizza, and they sat at the table as the box arrived. Sophie chatted about school, about how her friend Emma had tried to do a cartwheel at recess and fallen, and how the teacher had complimented her on her drawing. Aiden listened, nodding, but his gaze kept returning to her face, her green eyes that were so like his, her smile that always made his heart beat faster. She was his daughter. The test had proven it. But why did he feel so lost? After dinner, they settled on the couch. Sophie snuggled up to him as dinosaurs ran through the jungle on the screen. But her movements were slower than usual, and Aiden noticed that she was fiddling with the hem of her t-shirt, a habit she had when she was nervous. "Dad," she said suddenly, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Why are you living here now? Did you and Mom have a fight?" Aiden froze, his hand stilling on her head. He hadn't expected the question, not so soon. He thought Sophie, at 6, wouldn't yet notice the tension, but her eyes, large and serious, looked at him with concern. "Star," he began, trying to find the right words. "Sometimes adults, they have difficult conversations, but that doesn't mean we love you any less." Sophie frowned, her fingers still fiddling with her shirt. "But you don't come home," she said, her voice shaking. "Emma says her dad left too, and now he's living with another aunt. Will you do that too?" Aiden felt his throat tighten. He turned to her, taking her small hands in his. "No, Sophie," he said firmly, looking into her eyes. "I'm never leaving you. You're my little star, and I'll always be your daddy. Do you understand? Always." She nodded, but her eyes were shining with tears. "But why aren't you with Mom?" she asked. "You always laughed together, and now you're sad, and Mom is too." Aiden swallowed, his heart breaking. He didn't want to lie to her, but the truth was too much for a 6-year-old to bear. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and felt her small body tremble. "Your mother and we're going through a tough time right now," he said, trying to sound calm. "But we both love you very much, and we'll always be your parents, even if I live here. I promise." Sophie pressed herself against him, her voice muffled. "You won't stop being my dad?" she whispered. "Never," Aiden said, his voice breaking. He kissed the top of her head, tears stinging his eyes. "You're my little star, and no one's ever going to change that." She nodded, burying her face into his chest, and they sat there until the cartoon ended. Sophie began to yawn, and Aiden carried her to the fold-out couch Tom had borrowed for her sleepovers. He pulled a blanket over her, placing her teddy bear next to her, and watched her fall asleep, her breathing evening out. After she fell asleep, Aiden returned to the table where Nate's note lay. He clutched it in his fist, his anger flaring. Nate had no right to barge into their lives, to lay claim to Sophie. She was his daughter, and he wouldn't let anyone challenge that. But deep down, he knew he had to talk to Caitlin not for her sake, but for Sophie's. She deserved stability, even if their family was now fractured. It was a clear Saturday morning in Austin, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the old oak tree in front of Tom's house. Aiden Brooks stood in the open back of his truck, stacking wood, nails, and a can of paint. Today, he had planned to build a bird feeder with Sophie, a project he had promised her a month ago, before his world had been turned upside down. He glanced at his daughter's small form in the yard, Sophie in her favorite pink unicorn t-shirt, collecting the perfect branches for their future masterpiece. Her curls bounced as she hummed a song from a cartoon, and Aiden felt his heart momentarily lighten. It had been a week since the night Sophie had asked him why he was living apart. Her question, "Are you still going to be my dad?" still echoed in his head, fueling his determination to be there for her. The DNA test had confirmed that she was his daughter, but his anger at Caitlin and his anxiety over Nate's arrival had not gone away. He hadn't responded to Nate's note, hadn't talked to Caitlin about anything other than Sophie's schedule. But today, he wanted to focus on his daughter, to create something that would give them both a sense of normalcy. "Dad, will this branch do?" Sophie ran up, holding a crooked stick that looked more like a miniature tree, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. Aiden crouched down, examining her find with feigned seriousness. Little star, this is certainly the champion of branches," he said, rubbing his chin. "But for the feeder, we need stronger boards, and we'll use the branch for decoration, okay?" "It's coming," Sophie beamed, throwing the branch into a pile of other treasures. "And will the birds live in our feeder, like in the house?" "Maybe not live, but they'll definitely come flying in for treats," Aiden replied, taking the boards out of the trunk. "We'll paint it your favorite color. Which one do you choose?" "Pink," Sophie exclaimed, jumping up and down. "And glittery." Aiden laughed, his first real laugh in a week. Pink with glitter, birds will be shocked by such a fashionable feeder. They settled down in the yard on an old blanket Aiden had scrounged from Tom's apartment. He laid out his tools, a hammer, nails, a small saw, and began explaining to Sophie how they would build. She listened intently, her small hands fiddling with the hem of her t-shirt as he showed her how to join the boards together. "Dad, did you build bird feeders at school too?" she asked as Aiden hammered in the first nail. "Not really," he said, smiling. "I mostly fixed motorcycles. But once, Uncle Liam and I tried to build a birdhouse. It was all crooked, and the birds probably still laugh at us." Sophie giggled at the thought. "What did Mom build?" she asked, her voice a little quieter. Aiden froze, his hammer still in his hand. He hadn't expected her to mention Caitlin. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice even. "Mom, she was always into drawing," he said, going back to his work. "Remember how she taught you to draw unicorns? She used to make pictures like that when she was little." Sophie nodded, but her gaze became thoughtful. "Dad, why is Mom sad now?" she asked, looking at him with her big green eyes. "She cried yesterday when she thought I was sleeping." Aiden felt his throat tighten. He put the hammer down and turned to her, trying to find words that wouldn't hurt her. "Star," he began, sitting down next to her. "Sometimes adults get sad about difficult things. But you know what? Your mom and I will always love you, and that will never change." Sophie nodded, but her fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of the blanket. "Are you coming home?" she asked quietly. "I want us to be together again." Aiden swallowed, his heart breaking. He wanted to tell her that everything would be the same, but the lie caught in his throat. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "I'll always be with you, Sophie," he said, his voice hoarse. "Even if I live here, I'm your dad, and we'll make a bunch of cool things. Like this bird feeder, and maybe a birdhouse too, to really freak out the birds." Sophie giggled into his shoulder, and Aiden felt a sense of relief. He couldn't fix everything, but he could give her these moments. They went back to work, and soon the feeder was taking shape, not perfect, with a few crooked nails, but Sophie was thrilled. She insisted on painting it herself, and Aiden watched as she dabbed the pink paint on her hands and shirt. "Dad, look, I'm an artist, like Mom," she said, proudly showing off her dirty hands. "Best artist," Aiden agreed, wiping paint off her cheek. "But let's not turn ourselves into a pink dinosaur, okay?" By evening, the feeder was ready. They hung it on a tree in Tom's yard, filling it with seeds. Sophie stood with her hands on her hips, looking at her creation with pride. "Now the birds will come to us every day," she declared. "Dad, this is our tradition, right?" Aiden smiled, his heart clenching at her words. "That's right, little star. Our tradition. And we'll come up with a bunch more like these." As Sophie ran off to gather more branches for decoration, Aiden leaned against the tree, looking at the bird feeder. This day had been a ray of light in the darkness for him, but the shadow of Nate and Caitlin still hung over him. He pulled out the note Nate had left in his pocket, which he had never thrown away, and clutched it in his fist. He hadn't responded to Caitlin's texts, but he knew they would have to talk soon, not about forgiveness, but about how they would raise Sophie. Divorce was inevitable, but he wanted Sophie to have a stable childhood, even if their family was now fractured. Caitlin picked up Sophie at 8 p.m. She stood by the truck, her face pale, but she tried to smile as Sophie ran up to her, waving, drawing of a bird feeder. "Mom, Dad, and I made a birdhouse," Sophie exclaimed. "It's pink." "That's great, honey," Caitlin said, her voice soft but shaky. She looked at Aiden, her eyes begging to talk. "Aiden, can I—" "Not now," he snapped, his tone cold but calm. "I'll pick her up tomorrow after school." Caitlin nodded, looking down. She took Sophie's hand and led her to the car, but Sophie turned and waved at Aiden. "Dad, don't forget about the birds," she shouted. "I won't forget, little star," he replied, forcing himself to smile. It had been a week since their bird feeder day, and Aiden had tried to fill Sophie's life with small joys. They'd gone for bike rides, gone for ice cream, even started planning a new project, a birdhouse. But every time he'd handed her back to Caitlin, her sad eyes and attempts to talk reminded him of the rift in their family. He'd avoided her, limiting himself to short texts about his schedule, but he knew that today he'd have to talk face to face. The note from Nate, the musician who'd suddenly decided to find out about Sophie, still sat in the drawer like a smoldering ember, fueling his anger. There was a knock at the door and Aiden jumped, spilling some coffee on the table. He wiped the stain with his sleeve and went to answer it. Tom, his friend and temporary landlord, was standing there, holding a bag of donuts. "Hey, Brooks, you look like you're going to war," Tom said, walking in and throwing the bag on the table. His beard was covered in crumbs from his breakfast, and his eyes studied Aiden carefully. "You're meeting Caitlin today, right?" Aiden nodded, returning to the table. He opened his notebook, pointing his finger at the list. "Yes, we need to agree on how we will divide our time with Sophie. I don't want her to feel torn between us." Tom sat down opposite, pulling a donut out of the bag. "That's reasonable," he said, taking a bite. "But are you ready for this? To sit in the same room with her after everything?" Aiden's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around his mug. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm still angry, Tom. Every time I see her, I remember how she lied. But for Sophie's sake, I have to control myself." Tom nodded, chewing. "You'll get through this. You've always been a tough cookie. Just don't start yelling, okay? It's not Sophie's fault that her mom— Well, you get the idea." Aiden smiled weakly, but it was a strained smile. "I know. I'll do everything so that she doesn't get hurt. She's already asking why I'm not home." Tom clapped him on the shoulder as he stood up. "Then good luck, dude. If anything happens, I'm here. And donuts for courage." Aiden nodded, looking at the bag. He wasn't hungry, but the thought of Sophie's love for those pink-glazed donuts made him grab one for her. He stuffed the notebook into his jeans, put on his cap, and walked out to the truck. They were meeting at a neutral location, a small cafe in downtown Austin, where they'd once shared coffee on their first date. The irony of the choice wasn't lost on Aiden, but he pushed it aside as he got behind the wheel. The brew was cozy, with wooden tables and the smell of freshly brewed espresso. Aiden arrived first, taking a table by the window. He ordered a black coffee, though he knew he probably wouldn't drink it. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his notebook as he waited. His heart sank when the door opened and Caitlin walked in. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, and her usually bright smile a pale shadow. She noticed him, nodded, and sat down across from him, placing her bag on the chair. "Hello," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Aiden nodded, his face unreadable. "It's for Sophie," he said, his tone cool but even. "We need to agree on how we're going to do this." Caitlin swallowed, her fingers fiddling with the strap of her bag. "I know," she said. "I want her to be okay, so she doesn't feel like we're tearing her apart." Aiden opened his notebook, pulling out a pen. "I wrote out a schedule," he said, sliding the paper toward her. "I want to pick her up on weekends and 2 nights a week. School, practice, we can split it evenly, but I want her to know I'm always here for her." Caitlin took the paper, her eyes scanning the lines. She nodded, but her voice was shaking. "That seems reasonable," she said. "I can pick her up from school on Mondays and Wednesdays if you take Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the weekends. Well, the weekends are yours." Aiden looked at her, his gaze hard. "And no surprises, Kate," he said. "If anything changes, we tell each other. Sophie can't be left in the dark." Caitlin nodded, her eyes shining with tears. "I agree," she whispered. "Aiden, I know you don't want to hear this, but I'm so sorry. I never meant to." "Don't," he snapped, his voice sharper. "I don't want to talk about us. This is about Sophie. Only about her." She looked down, her fingers tightening on the schedule sheet. "Okay," she said quietly. "Just about Sophie." They spent another half hour going over details: who was picking Sophie up for soccer, who was helping with homework, how to split up the holidays. Aiden tried to be businesslike, but every time Caitlin looked at him, he saw her guilt, and it only fueled his anger. He thought about Nate, about his note, and wanted to ask if she'd contacted him, but he held back. Not here. Not now. When they finished, Caitlin stood up, her movements unsteady. "I can pick her up after school today," she said, "if that's okay with you." "Okay," Aiden replied, closing his notebook. "I'll come get her tomorrow." She nodded, but paused, her eyes pleading for something more. "Aiden," she began, her voice shaking, "if you ever want to talk, not about Sophie, but about us." "No, Kate," he said, his voice cold as steel. "It's over between us. I'm filing for divorce next week." Caitlin winced, her eyes filling with tears, but she nodded. "I understand," she whispered. I hope that someday you can forgive me." Aiden didn't answer, just stood up, leaving the money for the coffee on the table. He walked out of the cafe, feeling the fresh air hit him in the face. His chest tightened with a mixture of relief and pain. They had agreed on Sophie, and that was all that mattered. But Caitlin's words, her "I hope," sounded like a mockery in his head. Forgive. He didn't know if that was possible. Back at Tom's apartment, Aiden pulled out the donut he'd saved for Sophie and placed it on the table. He imagined how happy she'd be to see him tomorrow, and it gave him strength. Joint custody was the first step toward a new life where Sophie would remain his star, despite the rifts in their family. Austin was a quiet evening, with streetlights reflecting off the windows of an old community center on the edge of town. Aiden Brooks pulled his truck into the lot, turned off the engine, and sat for a few moments, staring at the brick building in front of him. Inside, a parent support group was meeting that Liam had told him about. Aiden wasn't sure if this was his place, sitting around with strangers and spilling his problems, but the anger that had been simmering inside him since he'd learned of Caitlin's betrayal was starting to choke him. He felt like he was losing himself, and for Sophie's sake, he had to find a way to cope. The meeting with Caitlin at the coffee shop yesterday, where they had agreed on joint custody, had left a bitter taste in his mouth. Her tears, her attempts to talk about us, had only made him angrier. And the note from Nate, the musician who had suddenly decided to insert himself into their lives, was still in the drawer, a reminder of the new threat. Aiden knew he couldn't let his anger get the better of him, not when Sophie needed it most. He took a deep breath, grabbed his cap from the passenger seat, and got out of the car. The inside of the community center smelled of coffee and old books. The meeting room was small, with a circle of folding chairs and a table covered with donuts and plastic cups. A few people were already sitting, talking quietly. Aiden paused in the doorway, feeling like an outsider. The people looked normal: a woman in a business suit, a guy with tattoos on his arms, an older couple holding hands. The moderator, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile and the name Linda on her name tag, noticed him and waved. "Welcome," she said, her voice warm but not cloying. "You must be Aiden. Liam said you were coming." Aiden nodded, rubbing his neck awkwardly. "Yeah, it's me," he muttered, sitting down on an empty chair in the corner. He could feel the others looking at him, but no one looked at him with condemnation, more like understanding. Linda started the meeting by introducing herself and laying out the rules. Talk if you want, listen if you don't. Aiden remained silent as the others shared their stories. The woman in the suit, Sarah, talked about her divorce and the custody battle over her son. The tattooed guy, Jake, talked about how his ex wouldn't let him see his daughter. Aiden listened, but his mind was on Sophie, her smile, her questions about why he wasn't home. He thought about Caitlin, about her lies, about Nate, who now knew about his daughter. "Aiden," Linda's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. "Want to share? No pressure, of course." He hesitated, his fingers tightening on the cap in his lap. All eyes were on him, but there was no judgment in them, only expectation. He cleared his throat, trying to collect himself. "I don't know where to begin," he said, his voice hoarse. "My wife, she cheated on me 7 years ago, before we got married, and I only recently found out that our daughter might not have been mine." There was silence in the room, But no one interrupted. Aiden continued, his words coming out in jerks. I did a DNA test. She's mine. Sophie is my daughter. But Caitlin, she knew it was possible, and she kept quiet. For 7 years. I can't forgive that. And now this guy she's with, he wants to talk about Sophie, like he has the right. His voice broke, and he clenched his fists. I filed for divorce. We agreed on joint custody, but I don't know how to live with this anger. I don't want Sophie to see this. Linda nodded, her gaze soft. Thank you for sharing, Aiden, she said. That's a big step. Do you feel like your anger is holding you back from being the father you want to be? Aiden nodded, his throat tightening. Yeah, he admitted. I look at Sophie, and she's everything to me. But then I remember what Caitlin did, and this, Nate, and I want to ruin it. But I can't. Not for her. Sarah, the woman in the suit, leaned forward, her voice calm. I understand, she said. When my husband left, I was so angry I could hardly breathe. But my son, he made me control myself. I learned to put my anger aside when he was around. That doesn't mean you forgive. It means you choose what's most important. Aiden looked at her, her words touching something inside. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Jake, the guy with the tattoos, added, Dude, anger is normal. But if you let it control you, it will take away all the good. I learned to write when I'm angry. I get it all out on paper. Maybe you should try that. Aiden smiled weakly. The idea seemed strange, but he nodded. Maybe I'll try, he said. Thank you. As the meeting continued, Aiden listened as others shared their stories. He felt a little less alone, knowing that he wasn't the only one struggling with pain. Linda ended the meeting by inviting everyone to grab a donut and coffee, and to his surprise, Aiden stayed. He poured himself a cup of coffee and started talking to Jake, who told him about drawing with his daughter to take his mind off his anger. Try something with Sophie, Jake said, sipping his coffee. It works for me with my little girl. We draw monsters, and I pretend they're my problems. She thinks it's just a game. Aiden nodded, figuring it out. The night was cool when he left the center, and the stars were bright over Austin. He climbed into his truck, feeling the weight in his chest ease a little. The group hadn't solved his problems, but it had given him something new and understanding that he wasn't alone, and an idea for how to deal with his anger. Back at Tom's apartment, Aiden pulled out an old notebook and began writing. He didn't know what he was doing, but the words started flowing. About Sophie, about her laugh, about how he was afraid of letting her down. He wrote about Caitlin, about the pain, about Nate, about his fear of losing everything. When he finished, his hand was shaking, but he felt some of the anger drain away, leaving room for something else. Determination. The next day, he picked up Sophie from school. She ran out to him, her backpack bouncing, and in her hands was a new drawing, a dinosaur in a football uniform. Dad, this is for you, she said, beaming. He plays for your team. Aiden laughed, hugging her. The best player, little star, he said. Want to draw another one, maybe a monster? Sophie beamed, nodding. Yes, with big teeth. It was a rainy Austin afternoon, casting a gray haze over the streets, turning the sidewalks into mirrors that reflected the dim streetlights. Aiden Brooks sat at the counter of Liam's Bean Around, sipping black coffee while his brother polished glasses and hummed the tunes on the radio. The smell of freshly ground beans and warm buns filled the air, but Aiden barely noticed. His mind was on Sophie. They'd drawn monsters the night before, as Jake from the support group had suggested, and her giggles at the toothy monster still echoed in his ears. But the shadow of Nate, the man who dared to claim a connection to his daughter, hung over him like a storm cloud. It had been a few days since the last support group meeting, and Aiden was starting to feel like his anger, while still there, was becoming more manageable. He'd been writing in a notebook at night, getting his anger out on paper, and that had helped. But the note Nate had left him at the coffee shop was still in his desk drawer, and its words I found out about Sophie. We need to talk burn him like hot coal. He hadn't responded to Caitlin's attempts to bring up Nate, but he knew the conversation was inevitable. Joint custody of Sophie had worked. He and Caitlin had cleared their days, and she'd stuck to the agreement, but the thought of Nate interfering was driving him crazy. Liam, noticing his brother's frowning face, threw the rag on the counter and sat down opposite him. "Hey, Brooks, you look like you swallowed a lemon again," he said, his dark eyes studying Aiden carefully. "What is it this time? Is Sophie okay?" "Sophie's fine," Aiden said, his voice low. "We were drawing yesterday. She made a monster with 3 eyes and called it Mr. Nasher." He smiled faintly, but it quickly faded. It wasn't her. It was this Nate. Liam frowned, crossing his arms. "Did he show up again?" he asked. "I thought he left a note and ran away." "Not yet," Aiden said, clutching his mug. "But I can't stop thinking about him. He knows about Sophie. He wants to talk. Why the hell is he even in our lives?" Liam sighed, rubbing his chin. "Look, I understand why you're mad, but you don't know what he wants. Maybe he just wants closure. Or an apology." "Apologize?" Aiden snorted, his voice sharpening. "He slept with my wife, Liam, and now he thinks he can just barge in and claim my daughter. No way." Liam raised his hands, calling for calm. "I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying you need to keep a cool head. For Sophie's sake. If you start a fight with him, it'll only make things worse." Aiden nodded, but his fists clenched beneath the table. He knew Liam was right, but the thought of Nate standing somewhere near his daughter made his blood boil. He took a sip of coffee, trying to calm himself, when the door to the coffee shop rang and a tall man walked in, a guitar case slung over his shoulder. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and he had an uncertain smile on his face. Aiden froze, his eyes instantly fixated on the stranger. He didn't know what Nate looked like, but something about the guy, the way he walked, the way he carried himself, told him it was him. The man walked up to the counter where Mia, the barista, was wiping down the coffee machine. Aiden tensed, his fingers tightening around his mug. "Hello," the man said, his voice soft but slightly husky. "I'm looking for Caitlin Brooks. Is she here?" Mia shook her head, glancing at Liam. "She's not here," she replied. "And who are you?" "Nate," he said, and Aiden felt his heart skip a beat. "Nate Collins. I'm an old friend. Just wanted to give her something." Aiden stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, drawing attention. Liam quickly stepped towards him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Aiden, don't," he whispered, but Aiden was already walking toward the counter, his face stony. "Are you Nate?" he asked, his voice cold but firm. "Nate, who left the note?" Nate turned, his eyes widening as he saw Aiden. He was slightly taller than Aiden, thin, with a light beard and a tired look in his eyes. He raised his hands in surrender. "You must be Aiden," he said, his voice calm but careful. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I just—" "Just what?" Aiden snapped, his voice rising, drawing the eyes of his customers. "You want to talk about Sophie, my daughter?" Nate swallowed, his gaze darting to Liam, then back to Aiden. "I just found out," he said, his voice quiet. "I didn't know about her before. I just want to understand what's going on. I'm not trying to take anything away." Aiden stepped closer, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles turned white. "Take her away," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You've done enough, Nate. You slept with my wife. You think you can just barge into our lives and pretend you have rights to my daughter?" Liam stepped between them, his hand pressing against Aiden's chest. "Hey, brother, calm down," he said firmly. "Not here, not now." Nate took a step back, his face tense. "I don't want to fight, Aiden," he said. "I just want to talk to Caitlin, find out the truth. If Sophie is mine." "She's not yours," Aiden snapped, his voice like steel. "She's my daughter. I raised her. I was there every day. And you? Where have you been for 7 years?" Nate looked down, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I swear I didn't know. Caitlin never told me." Aiden wanted to respond, wanted to let out all his anger, but the image of Sophie, her smile, her dad look, was in his head. He couldn't let this turn into a scene, not here, not in front of everyone. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to back away. "Leave us alone," he said, his voice low but menacing. "You have no right to her. And if I see you anywhere near Sophie, you'll be in trouble." Nate nodded, his face pale. "I get it," he said, backing toward the door. "I didn't mean to. I just—" He paused, turned, and walked out, his guitar case swinging behind him. Aiden watched him go, his chest heaving. Liam squeezed his shoulder, his voice calm. "You did it," he said. "But, brother, you have to control yourself. For Sophie's sake." Aiden nodded, but his hands were still shaking. He walked back to the table and finished his coffee, but it tasted like ash. Nate knew about Sophie, and he wasn't going to disappear. Aiden felt like this was just the beginning, and he needed to be ready to protect his daughter at all costs. A deep blue dusk was falling over Austin, casting a soft glow of lanterns over the small courtyard behind Tom's apartment. Aiden Brooks sat on an old folding chair, sipping a warm beer as his gaze wandered to the pink bird feeder he and Sophie had made the week before. It hung from the branch of an old oak tree, swaying slightly in the breeze, and a few sparrows were already circling, pecking at the seeds. Aiden smiled, remembering Sophie, covered in paint, proudly declaring it the hottest birdhouse ever. But the smile faded quickly. His encounter with Nate at Liam's coffee shop the night before was still burning inside him like hot coal. It had been a day since he had confronted Nate, the man whose name was now synonymous with Caitlin's betrayal. His words, "I didn't know about Sophie," had sounded sincere, but Aiden couldn't help but feel angry. Nate had no right to barge into their lives, to claim a connection to his daughter. Sophie was his, the DNA test had proven it, and more importantly, so had years of love and laughter and care. But Nate's shadow reminded him of the fragility of their new reality. Joint custody, divorce, trying to keep it together for Sophie. It was quiet inside the apartment. Sophie was asleep on the fold-out couch Tom had assigned for her to sleep on. Aiden had insisted she stay over that evening after picking her up from school. They had spent the day together, riding bikes in the park, eating pizza, drawing Mr. Gummy, the three-eyed monster Sophie had made up. These moments were a lifeline to Aiden, but her questions, "Dad, are you coming home?" still cut like knives. He didn't know how to explain to a 6-year-old that their family had changed forever. Aiden finished his beer and entered the apartment, closing the door quietly so as not to wake Sophie. The room was dark, except for the streetlight shining through the blinds, casting streaks of light on the walls. He walked over to the couch where Sophie lay asleep, her small body curled under the covers. Her teddy bear, much worn, was clutched to her chest, her curls scattered across the pillow. Aiden crouched down next to her, his heart aching with tenderness. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, and he felt tears stinging his eyes. He gently brushed the lock of hair from her face, careful not to wake her. In that moment, everything, the anger at Caitlin, the fury at Nate, the pain of betrayal faded away. Only Sophie remained, his star, his reason to keep going. He remembered how she had laughed earlier today when he had pretended to be afraid of her painted monster, and how she had proudly shown him her new bike trick, no hands, she had proudly declared, though she had only one finger on the handlebars. "Dad," Sophie murmured suddenly, her voice sleepy, her eyes half closed. She stirred, holding the bear closer. "Are you there?" Aiden smiled, his voice soft. "Right here, little star," he whispered, stroking her head. "Sleep, everything's okay." She nodded, her eyes closing, but she reached out a small hand, grabbing his finger. "You're not leaving?" she muttered, her voice barely audible. Aiden swallowed, his throat tightening. He squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth of her small fingers. "Never," he said firmly. "I'll always be with you, Sophie. I promise." She smiled in her sleep, her breathing even. Aiden looked at her, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. This moment, her hand in his, her trust, her love was what kept him going. He knew the anger was still there, deep down, but in that moment it didn't matter. Sophie was his daughter, and nothing, not Caitlin, not Nate, not divorce could change that. He stood, quietly adjusting his blanket, and walked back to the table where his notebook lay. The support group had taught him to pour his emotions out on paper, and he began to write, his pen scratching the page. He wrote about Sophie, about her laugh, about the way she called him the best dad, about the way her curls smelled like shampoo. He wrote about his pain, about how Caitlin's betrayal still stung, about Nate, whose presence threatened his world. But in the end, he wrote, "She's mine, and I won't let anyone take that away from her." When he was finished, he closed the notebook and looked out the window at the bird feeder. A sparrow landed on it, pecking at the seeds, and Aiden felt the corners of his lips twitch. Sophie was right, this was their birdhouse, their tradition, and he would make new traditions, new memories, so she would know her daddy was always there. There was a knock at the door and Aiden frowned. It was late, almost 10 o'clock. He opened the door to find Caitlin, her face pale and her eyes red. She was holding Sophie's bag, which had been forgotten that morning. I just brought her things," she said, her voice shaking. "Can I come in?" Aiden tensed, his hand tightening on the door handle. "Sophie is asleep," he said coldly. "Put the bag here, I'll give it to her in the morning." Caitlin nodded, but her eyes were full of pain. "Aiden," she began, her voice quiet. "I know you don't want to see me, but I got a text from Nate. He wants to meet up. I haven't answered, but—" Aiden felt his fists clench. "Don't you dare," he snapped, his voice low but full of anger. "Don't you dare let him into our lives, Kate. Sophie is mine. You know it. The test proved it." Caitlin nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I know," she whispered. "I don't want him near her. I don't know how to stop it." Aiden stepped closer, his voice firmer. "You tell him to stay away," he said, "or I will, and he won't like the way I do it." Caitlin nodded, looking down. "I will," she said. "I will do everything to protect Sophie and you." The stars twinkled above Austin, their light filtering through the wispy clouds as Aiden Brooks sat on Tom's front porch, his arms wrapped around his knees. The evening air was cool, with the faint scent of damp grass from a recent rain. A mug of cold tea sat on the old wooden table in front of him, and next to it was a photograph of Sophie, a snapshot from their trip to the lake last summer, her face smeared with ice cream as she laughed on his shoulders. Aiden watched her smile, his heart aching with a mixture of love and pain. It had been a month since he'd learned of Caitlin's betrayal, and even though the DNA test had confirmed that Sophie was his daughter, the wounds were still raw. Last night with Sophie, her sleepy, "You're not leaving?" her small hand squeezing his finger, had given him a new push. He knew he had to move forward for her. Joint custody with Caitlin had worked, they had clearly divided their days, and Sophie seemed happy moving from one house to the next. But the shadow of Nate, his unexpected appearance and note, still hung over Aiden. Meeting him at Liam's coffee shop, his words, "I didn't know about Sophie," had stoked the anger that Aiden had been trying to tame with the help of a support group. Writing in a notebook, pouring out his emotions, and it helped, but it couldn't erase the pain. Aiden sipped his tea, his gaze drifting to the pink bird feeder hanging in the oak tree. The sparrows were still pecking at the seeds, and he smiled, remembering Sophie proudly calling it the hippest. These little traditions, the bird feeder, the bike rides, the monster painting, had become his anchor. But he knew there was a long way to go. The divorce papers had already been filed, and the lawyer had said it would be quick, given their agreement to joint custody. But each step toward a new life felt heavy, like he was leaving a piece of himself behind. The door creaked and Tom stepped out onto the porch, holding a bottle of beer, his beard glinting in the lantern light, his eyes studying Aiden. "So, Brooks, are you philosophizing under the stars again?" he said, sitting down on the next chair. "Or are you just hiding from the world?" Aiden smiled weakly, shrugging. "A little of this, a little of that," he said, his voice tired but calm. "Just thinking. About Sophie. About how everything has changed." Tom nodded, taking a sip of beer. "I know," he said. But you know, you're holding up better than I expected. After everything with Caitlin and this Nate, I could have punched someone by now. Aiden snorted, but there was no humor in his laugh. Believe me, I wanted to, he admitted. When I saw him in the coffee shop, I almost lost it. But Liam's right, I can't let my anger get the better of me. Not for Sophie. Tom whistled, shaking his head. You've become quite the wise man, he said, grinning. A support group works wonders, huh? Aiden nodded, his gaze returning to Sophie's photo. It helps, he said. It doesn't solve everything, but there are people there who understand. They've been through hell, too. And that, I don't know, it gives me hope that I won't go crazy. Tom clapped him on the shoulder, his voice becoming more serious. You won't, he said. You're too stubborn, and you have Sophie. That little girl won't let you break. Aiden smiled, genuinely this time. Yes, she is my lifeline, he said. She asked me again today if I would come home. I don't know how to explain to her that I won't, but I want her to know that I am always with her. Tom nodded, leaning back in his chair. You'll find a way, he said. You always have. What about Caitlin? Is she still trying to get you back? Aiden's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around his mug. She calls, she texts, he said. She says she wants to fix everything. But I can't, Tom. I see her, and all I see is a lie. And Nate, he's still out there somewhere. I told her to keep him away from Sophie, but I don't know if she'll listen. Tom frowned, his voice becoming firmer. If this guy shows up, let me know, he said. I'm not Liam. I'm not going to tell you to keep a cool head. We'll figure it out. Aiden laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. Thank you, he said, but I can handle it. For Sophie's sake, I have to. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the cicadas and the distant sounds of the city. Aiden thought about the support group, about how Sarah, the woman in the business suit, had said that anger was a choice that could be put aside for the sake of his children. He thought about Jake, drawing with his daughter to cope with the pain. These people, strangers yet so familiar in their struggle, gave him a new perspective. He wasn't ready to forgive Caitlin, he might never be, but he was beginning to understand that his anger didn't have to define him. He stood, stretching, and walked into the apartment to check on Sophie. She was asleep on the pull-out couch, her teddy bear tucked to her chest, her curls spread out over the pillow. Aiden sat down next to her, his gaze softening. He carefully adjusted the blanket, feeling the warmth of her breath soothe him. She was his daughter, his little star, and no amount of testing or Nate could change that. Back on the porch, he pulled out the notebook he always carried with him now. He began to write, his pen scratching in the quiet of the night. He wrote about Sophie, her laughter, the way she called him the best dad, their bird feeder, her dream of catching bigger fish. He wrote about his fear of letting her down, the anger he still felt at Caitlin burning inside him. But at the end, he wrote, I don't know what comes next. But for Sophie, I will find a way. One step at a time. When he was finished, he closed the notebook and looked up at the stars. For the first time in weeks, he felt not just pain, but hope, weak but real. The divorce, Nate, Caitlin, they were all part of his journey, but Sophie was his destination. He didn't know if he could ever forgive Caitlin, but he knew he could be the father Sophie deserved. Aiden, Tom's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. Are you okay? Aiden nodded, his voice quiet but firm. Yes, he said. I'll be fine. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.